Well, hello everyone. Some good reception today, and this goes smoothly. We're going through the Gospel of John together, and we just finished. Well, last week we went through chapter 10, and I have a few thoughts. So if you want to follow along, go ahead and get your Bible out, turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 10. We just finished a scene where uh, Jesus has attended the Feast of Dedication, and that's actually the Hanukkah festival, and it celebrates the Hanukkah festival celebrates the time when uh, the Jews, the Maccabees, really, um, they cleansed the temple and fought to reclaim the temple, and it was during this time that the Seleucids uh, had conquered the area around Israel, including Israel, and they persecuted the Jews. They tried to eliminate the Jewish religion. They forbid circumcision. Trying to remember some of the other things they did, but they enacted some terrible, terrible policies that were designed to suppress the Jewish religion. And this was a time of persecution for the Jews. Yeah, Antiochus Epiphanes was his name, the king, and he banned circumcision. He desecrated the temple. He turned the temple into a brothel. He used the altar on the temple to sacrifice pig flesh. All of these things were intended to suppress, insult the Jews. I even read women who did circumcise their babies, their male babies, were executed. It was pretty awful. Anyway, after this persecution, this terrible persecution happened, the Maccabees reconquered the temple, and they cleansed the temple. And that's when the oil in the temple miraculously lasted for 8 days. That's what's familiar to you if you know Hanukkah. And they cleansed the temple and rededicated the temple. Oh, I see Kitty. Hi, Kitty. Good to see you. Wish you were here. Thanks for chiming in. If anyone who's watching, feel free to say hello. Anyway, so they cleansed the temple, because all these awful things had been done in the temple to defile it, and they cleansed the temple and rededicated it and began to sacrifice again. And anyway, the theme of light, the light in the temple, and the miraculous oil lasting longer than 8 days, that's what Hanukkah celebrates. And so when Jesus says, "I'm the light of the world," that celebration of Hanukkah and the cleansing of the temple would all have come to mind. Jesus, that's one of the great claims, of course, Jesus makes about himself, is that he's light. He is the light of the world. The light that shines in our lives, the light that allows us to see and recognize each other. Light, especially if you don't have electricity, light is so precious because it allows us to work. It allows us to recognize the people we love. Light is essential to all of life, and Jesus says, "I am that light. I am what gives life purpose and value and meaning." Now, I said last week that after chapter 10, there's a transition. From here on out, we're moving towards the cross. Jesus has left Jerusalem, and from this point, he's going to start moving back towards Jerusalem for the last time. And when he comes to Jerusalem again, it'll be his last trip to Jerusalem. And he seems to know that. So there's a sense now in the Gospel of John that we are in the last act of this play, and we are moving towards the climax. And for Jesus, the cross is that climax. And Jesus speaks about the cross in John as his glorification. The phrase that the writer of the Gospel of John likes to use is the cross is the moment where Jesus is lifted up. It's almost like for John, the crucifixion and the resurrection are part of the same movement of ascent, right? That the being lifted up literally on the cross is actually the beginning of this bigger movement from earth to heaven, where Jesus is going to prepare a place for us. So that John talks about the cross a little bit differently, and I think it's beautiful and it's helpful to us. So we're in chapter 11. I'm going to stop talking now and let the Bible speak. Chapter 11, verse 1. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. Now this is a picture of Jesus' personal life that some of the other gospels don't give us. This trio, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, were friends of Jesus. They weren't numbered among the disciples or the official disciples. They're not one of the 12, but Jesus loved them. And so we have a picture. This is a personal relationship. You know, Jesus was a rabbi and he had his students. He was their teacher. He was their formal rabbi. They were his formal students. But Jesus, we don't often think of Jesus having other relationships, but he did. He was a normal human being, and these were his personal friends that he loved. There's some indication that Mary and Martha helped support Jesus financially too, because after all, he didn't have a job. The disciples didn't have jobs either. They had left their professions. So that's the relationship Jesus has with these three. It's a special relationship. And he loves Lazarus. So that's what we're told. Verse 4. When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. That's the second time we're told that. Jesus loved these people. He loved them. They were his personal friends. So John really wants us to know the intensity of Jesus' emotions and his humanness. Yet when he heard Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. So he gets the news, Jesus gets the news that his friend is sick, and he doesn't come right away. He waits for 2 days. We don't know for sure why. He may have had teaching to do. He may have had a reason to stay where he was. But Jesus seems unworried. He says this is going to turn out okay. And we'll find out what that means later on. Verse 7. Then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, the disciples, "a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you are going back there." Now, remember, I said before, Jesus had left Judea. The last time he had been there was for the festival, and he'd gone away. And he knows that the next time he comes is going to be his last. And so the disciples say, "Are you sure, Jesus? You sure you want to go back there? The last time you were there, you made a lot of trouble. You made a lot of enemies. And they aren't going to be happy with you. If you go back there, you're going to be at risk." The disciples know what's at stake. They know what the risk is. And they're saying to Jesus, "Are you really sure you want to do this? Are you really sure you want to put yourself in harm's way?" And in this case, the reason Jesus does it, it's not necessarily because he has a grand plan, or because it's part of his larger strategy, but he's going to go back to Jerusalem because his friend needs his help. And Jesus isn't going to be kept away. So the disciples warn him. They're concerned because Jesus has already made a reputation for himself, and a dangerous one. Now Jesus replies to the disciples after they object. Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light." Jesus is saying sort of 2 things here, is that there's limited time, and the end's going to come sooner or later, and while there's time, it's time to work. And so there's work to be done. In this case, that's helping his friend, and so he's going to do that work when the opportunity is there. There's also a second level of this meaning, which is Jesus has just told us that he's what? The last chapter, he is the light. He's the light of the world. And so when Jesus is available to us, the light is shining. When Jesus offers himself to us, the light shines. And so there's a subtext here that while you have the opportunity to come to the light, you should take it. Because there's 12 hours in the day, and that's an opportunity to work, but the opportunity doesn't last forever. And so there's both opportunity and a limit to opportunity. Verse 11, after he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." The Bible often uses the term sleep to talk about death. Paul describes in Thessalonians, which I read at every funeral, those who have fallen asleep. That's how Paul refers to the dead, that they've fallen asleep. There's several other places where death is referred to as a kind of sleep. And for the Bible, death is not a final reality, and so it makes sense that we would use the metaphor of sleep. Verse 12. His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better," right? So the disciples are thinking like, doctors. I tell my kids this, right, when they're sick, go to sleep. Go to sleep. That'll make you feel better. Daddy, I'm tired. What do I do? Go to sleep. Daddy, I don't feel well. Sleep. Sleep is a wonderful cure. We know that. Doctors will tell us that. And so that's how they're thinking. They're thinking, well, if he's asleep, that's good. Sick people should sleep. That's how they get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep, which tells us, right, Jesus likes to talk. He likes to speak in metaphors. His disciples sometimes take him too literally, and that's true often of Christians. Sometimes we take things too literally, and God means them more figuratively or metaphorically, which says as Christians, when we come to the scriptures, we need to be looking for the metaphorical meaning. Sometimes there's things to take literally, but if we take everything literally, then we'll miss the point, just like the disciples have here. So this sets a little example for us and reminds us again what we already know, that metaphor is part of the way Jesus teaches and the way God speaks. Now, verse 14. So they told him plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Then Thomas said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." That's some foreshadowing there. So let's talk about, there's such a ton here, and I hope I'm not going too slow for you, but I can't help myself. There's so much here. Finally, Jesus just lays it out. He gets literal because they don't seem to be getting the hint. He's saying, no, by sleep I'm talking about death. He's dead. And I'm glad he's dead, because now you're going to get to see something. Now you're really going to see who I am and what I can do. Remember, all of Jesus' signs in the Gospel of John are signs of who he is. They're signs that identify him as the Son of God, as the one who reveals God, who is sent by the Father. So he's saying he's dead, and I'm actually glad, because this is an opportunity. And Thomas says, "Let us also go, that we may die with him," which is a profound expression of loyalty. And so Thomas knows again how dangerous it is. If Jesus goes to Jerusalem, he may be killed. And Thomas, in his enthusiasm and his commitment to Jesus, says, "Let's go too. If he's going to go die, let's go die with him." We know that's not going to happen. We know the disciples basically run away, but their heart's in the right place. So you have to smile, I think, at what Thomas says, and recognize that all of us are like this, right? That in one moment we can be enthusiastic in our faith and support for Jesus, and in the next moment we can become doubtful, weak, even too scared to do what God wants of us. All right, so they decide they're going to go with him. Now he comes, verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. That's a long time, especially for the Jews. Their standard practice was to bury after 3, and apparently they've been waiting for Jesus. Lazarus needs to go in the ground. That's the longest amount of time that Jews would be able to wait before they put a body in the ground. because Jews, they didn't embalm, and Jews didn't practice cremation. That someone was talking to me the other day about how strange it is that we bury people. We just put somebody in the ground in a box, and we get that from Judaism. Judaism always practiced earth burial. Pagans practiced cremation. Now that's not to say that today you can't be cremated. There's nothing wrong with cremation. Just the history is Jews practiced burial, and for that reason they had to do it soon, because they don't burn the body and the body begins to rot. And as gross as that sounds, there's actually a spiritual meaning to that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So let's keep going. So he'd been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. Now, so there's a crowd. This isn't just an intimate gathering, there's a lot of folks here. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Some of you who are familiar with the Bible will recognize those characteristics. Martha and Mary, two very different personalities. They're sisters, but they couldn't be more different. Martha's the busy bee, the worker, and Mary is the introvert and the more restful, more contemplative. And you can think of them that way. One, Mary exemplifies the contemplative personality, and Martha represents the more active, busy profile or personality trait. Neither one is right or wrong, right? God made us all different for a reason. You need both kinds of people in life, but that's who they are. So Martha comes out, and Mary's still inside. She stayed at home because she's again the contemplative introvert. I'm a little bit more like Mary, but thank God we have Marthas in this church that are always, they're busy and working, and just like Martha, God needs both types. Now, 21, Martha is about to speak. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. So it sounds like she's a combination of frustrated that Jesus has taken so long, but still respectful and faithful. So she's like, I really wish you would have got here sooner, but I know that you can still do something about it. And I want to talk here a little bit about one of the themes that runs through this chapter is that Jesus is not in a hurry. He never really is. Jesus is never in a hurry. He's never lazy. He doesn't just sit around and do nothing, but he's never frantic. He's never too busy. He's never running around like a chicken with its head cut off. And I think that teaches us something, that the way we should live an unhurried life. If we trust God and we know that God has a plan, and we are being diligent, we're working when the light is out, when the sun is out, then we don't need to be in a rush, and we don't need to have this kind of anxious energy that we see in the world. It really disturbs me. I think it's part of maybe our American way of life, but this constant frenetic energy of busyness. And I brought it up before, the way you hear people brag about how little they sleep, or brag about how many hours they work. I don't think that's something to brag about. You don't want to be lazy, but frenetic busyness is not a sign of a healthy human being. Not really even the sign of a productive human being, although we've mistaken it for that. No, I think Jesus shows us what a productive human being looks like. And it's someone who works hard when there's the opportunity, but who doesn't rush, who is not busy. Busyness is not good, but Jesus is calm, non-anxious, and diligent, but never rushed, never hurried, never anxious with frenetic oh, I gotta get there. I gotta do the next thing. I'll just tell this story. It reminds me of when I was a chaplain at the hospital, and in our training, our supervisor told us that uh, in the hospital we were never to run. Right? Sometimes there's code. Sometimes there's code blue, right? If you've been in the hospital, you've heard the code blue. That means somebody's crashing. There's urgent things that happen in a hospital, but our supervisor said never, ever, ever run. Doctors sometimes will run, nurses might run in the emergency room, and that's fine. That's their job. But for you, who are representing God, you don't run. You get up and you walk where you need to go, but you are to. Oh, and his reason was this: that a chaplain in representing God should always have a non-anxious presence. We should never appear hurried. We should never appear anxious. We should never appear panicked, because our job is to bring the comfort and the peace of God's presence. And so I think that's what Jesus does here. Jesus does not rush. He is not panicked. He does not show anxiety. He takes his time. He gets there when he gets there, because he represents eternity. He represents a perspective that is divine, where there is no limitation of time, and that's important. Now, verse 22 or verse 23, Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Right? That simple message: your brother will rise again. There's hope. That's the message the Christian brings to any situation of crisis. A Christian brings a sense of peace and calm, a non-anxious presence, and the Christian brings a message of hope. Your brother will rise again. But her answer is interesting, right? Jesus says, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." I have to pause here. Jews believed in a resurrection of the body. That was part of their belief system at the time of Jesus. They believed in resurrection before Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus rising from the dead did not introduce the concept of resurrection. Right? It's in the book of Daniel. It's in the Old Testament. Jews believed that God would raise the dead, and this came about, and for Jews, and for us too, by extension, this belief in resurrection grew out of a sense of justice. A sense of justice. That's where the belief in the resurrection came from. Because Jews believed that God was just, yet they looked around and they lived in a world where justice was not served. And we live in the same world. It's no different. The weak and the good and the righteous suffer when they don't deserve it, and the wicked prosper when they don't deserve it. And that plays out individually. We all know good people who suffer much more than they deserve, and we can probably all think of people who are less than scrupulous, less than honest, who enjoy prosperity and benefits and blessings maybe when they shouldn't. But it plays out nationally too. Israel had been persecuted, as I said at the beginning of this. They were persecuted by the Greeks, by the Seleucids, by the Romans. Justice, they looked at the world and they saw that justice did not happen in this world. And so they said, there must be another life. There must be a life beyond this. Justice doesn't always find us in this life, so therefore there must be a life beyond it. And it was rooted in the belief that God was just. Because God is just, and justice doesn't happen in this life, there must be more. There must be a life to come. So justice actually drove the belief in a resurrection. That because in this world we don't see justice, there must be another world. And they called it that. They called it the Olam Haba, which means the world to come, or the life to come. So resurrection was part of their belief system about how God would bring justice. And so they believed that one day God would come and raise the dead, and he would reward the righteous nations, the righteous individuals, and he would bring justice to the wicked and give them their due. So that's what they. So Martha says, "Yeah, I know he's going to rise. I know that's going to happen. When God finally raises the dead and finally brings justice, that's what's going to happen." So that's what she's thinking. But Jesus says this: Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. She's right. There will be a resurrection, but it will be through Jesus. Jesus is the one who raises the dead. It's through Jesus that the dead rise. In other words, what Jesus is saying is, yes, you're right, the resurrection is going to happen, but I am the cause of the resurrection. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? And that's the question John wants you to answer. Why does John write his gospel? He's told us already. We talked about this in the first week. He writes so that you would come to believe in Jesus, believe in who he is, believe in his promises. So Jesus puts this question to Martha. I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe me? Do you believe this? And her answer is, yes, Lord. She told him, I believe that you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. So in other words, Jesus is that figure in Daniel called the Son of Man, who comes and raises the dead and brings justice to the world, brings justice to humanity. So she's identified him these three ways. He is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, one with the Father, and who has come into the world. Why? To raise the dead and to mete out justice. Now, this message about life, I've got a note here I want to share with you that, there's eternal life in Greek has two different dimensions. The dimension we often think of is that it's never ending, that Jesus came to bring life without end. We live forever, right? In the sense of duration. But eternal life, and in Greek, eternal has this second, I'd call a depth dimension. So there's the duration, the maybe the horizontal dimension, life that goes on forever. But there's a depth dimension to that life, which is real, deep life, a life with joy, a life full, a life that's full and complete. So long life and big life, long life and deep, meaningful life that Jesus has come to give. And the word eternal life here has both of those dimensions, that our life both goes forever without end, but it also has this depth dimension that our life is full, our life is complete. It's not shallow, it's not boring, it's full of joy and love. Verse 28. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here. So John is full of titles. John loves titles. So Jesus is the light of the world. Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Jesus is the Messiah. All these titles, the Son of God, and now the teacher, right? And all of these titles belong to Jesus, and they all tell us something about who he is. And that's, again, what John wants us. John wants us to know Jesus. All these titles help us understand him. So he is life, he's resurrection, he's light, he's Messiah, he's Son of God, and he's our teacher. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. So she's bringing Mary aside and saying, Jesus is here. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. So Martha's pulled Mary aside, whispered in her ear, and said, our teacher is here. And when Mary hears this, she jumps up and she runs out, and everyone sees it and starts to follow her. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Again, Jesus has not been rushed, and that's actually a little bit frustrating to those around him. They want him to be rushed. They wanted him to hurry, but he came in his own time. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Okay, that's Jesus was moved in spirit and troubled. We start to see the pain. Jesus feels grief. And we shouldn't think of Jesus as being somehow beyond human emotions. Every human emotion was part of Jesus' humanity. He was susceptible to every feeling that we're susceptible to. Joy, excitement, fear, loss, sadness, anxiety, grief, all of it. And here he's filled with this emotion. And that's what I love John. I've been preaching through, we've been preaching through John Sunday morning, and I've been leading this study. John shows Jesus both at his most divine and his most human. John, more than any other writer, talks about Jesus being one with God. The statement, before Abraham was, I am. What a powerful statement of Jesus' divinity. We don't get that in any other gospel. But we also don't get in any other gospel such a human picture of Jesus who's crying, who's weeping, who has personal friends, not a professional relationship, not even necessarily formal, but just people he loves, and he's sad. So we see Jesus at his most human and at his most divine in John's gospel. He's deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Verse 34, "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. That's John chapter 11, verse 35. It's the shortest verse in the Bible. The shortest verse in the Bible is 2 words. Jesus wept. And again, his humanity. Jesus shows us what it means to be truly human. And to be truly human is to feel emotions. And that's important for us to know. I want to share with you this, a great quote from Irenaeus, who's one of the early church fathers, who was one of the disciples of a disciple of John, the writer of this gospel. And he has a famous quote, and he said, "The glory of God is a human being fully alive." In Latin, "Gloria Dei est viviens homo." The glory of God is a human being fully alive. We talk about the glory of God, but what does glorify God? What is God pleased with? What glorifies God? And what glorifies God is a human being fully alive. And that's important because God's glory is not competitive with ours, right? What glorifies God is not what diminishes us. Quite the opposite, according to Irenaeus. What glorifies God is what makes us fully alive. So a human being full of life, full of joy, full of love, that's what glorifies God. Not a human being debased. And that God is not in competition with us. It's not the glory of God versus the glory of man, right? The glory of God is the human being fully alive. And in our sermon series on John 2 weeks ago, John chapter 1, what does Jesus come here to do? He's come here to make human beings in God's image, to give us the power to be human, created in God's image, to be children of the Most High. So, I see Carla. Hi, Carla. Good to see you. I'm glad you're both here. Say hi in the comments if you're watching. We can have a little bit of fellowship here, and just know that we're sharing this time with each other. Hi, Carla. Okay, so if the glory of God is a human being fully alive, it's worth memorizing. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. And that's going to be played out in this passage, because you know how the story ends. Jesus was going to raise Lazarus from the dead and show that the glory of God is a human being alive. All right. "Where have you laid him? Come and see." Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "How he loved him." So the crowds can see Jesus' pain and his sorrow, and that is a sign for them of how much he loved his friend. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. There's a stench. He's been in the tomb 4 days. He's begun to rot." Why does the Bible tell us this? Why, at the beginning, John started out by telling us that he'd been dead for 4 days. Now we're hearing that there's a stench, right? Why did John include this sort of gruesome detail in this story? There's 3 times in the Bible where Jesus raises the dead. Maybe you'll remember them. The first time Jesus raises someone who's dead. In other words, this isn't the first time Jesus has raised the dead. He's done it twice before. First, he raises Jairus' daughter. Jairus was the synagogue leader whose daughter had fallen ill and died. Jesus raised her from the dead. And then there's the widow's son. He raised the little boy from the dead. Both of these are children. Um, and both of them were within a short time after the child. I think Jesus raises the little girl, Jairus' daughter, within hours after she died. And with the widow's son, it's before the burial. He hasn't even been entombed yet, so it's been less than a couple days. But here it's been 4 days, and he's begun to rot. Now, again, why does John tell us this? Uh, and I think we'll go. Let me finish. So there's a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" Remember, the glory of God. Jesus is saying that this is a chance to reveal the glory of God. Now, so they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Now, why does he tell us again why does John tell us that Lazarus was rotting and stinking? It's simple. It's never too late. It's never too late with God. And it ties into this theme of not being hurried or rushed. In God's time, it's never too late. God represents the point of view of eternity, and there's no such thing as too late. It's never too late to turn around your life. It's never too late to repent. God's power is not limited by time, and that's the Christian perspective. Sure, as in the hospital, doctors and nurses who are working with physical health may need to rush, but the chaplain doesn't, because with God's time, it's never too late. We can look at this several ways, right? It's never too late for God to bring life out of death. It's never too late for us to be forgiven. And there is no such thing as a ruined life. I hate that phrase. You'll ruin your life, or his life was ruined, or her life was ruined. No, Christians don't believe in a ruined life. Even when your life is dead and rotting and stinking, when the stench rises to high heaven, it's still not too late. There's nothing that God can't redeem. There's no death that God can't bring life to. And this is a fulfillment, by the way, of Ezekiel chapter 37, verse 12. That's the famous scene of the dry bones. You might be familiar with it. And Ezekiel says, God will open your graves and lift you out of your graves. And that can be applied to your life, wherever you are right now. You may be in a grave, and your grave is whatever limits your life. Your grave might be your depression. Your grave might be your isolation. Your grave might be your bitterness. Your grave might be your resentment, right? A relationship, someone you're still mad at, and you can't stop being angry with them. Our grave is whatever limits our life. Remember, and the life that Jesus brings is both long in duration and deep. And so a grave can be the end of our life, but it can also be what's keeping our life from being fulfilling. And God can raise you out of that grave. And it doesn't matter how deep the grave is, and it doesn't matter how long you've been in it. There's always hope. So Lazarus comes out. He says, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go. Let him live. Let the past go. The sin, the death is gone. Take off the clothes, put on new clothes, and begin your life again." Now, verse 45. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Remember this, the more attention Jesus gets, the closer he comes to being crucified. And ironically, again, Jesus refers to his crucifixion as his glorification. For Jesus, in his mind, his crucifixion is his glorification. Now, verse 46. But some of them went to the Pharisees, told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the sort of the high council of the Jews, and it was a council with two parties. You could think of it like a two-party system, actually. Um, not really conservative or liberal like we have two parties, but two religious parties, and they were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the leaders of the Pharisees and the leaders of the Sadducees would come together on a council, and that was called the Sanhedrin. And the Pharisees were like the rabbis; they were the teachers of the law. You can think of Pharisee equals rabbi. They were teachers. Sadducee equals priests. They ran the temple. So that's who these people are. The chief priests and the Pharisees, so Pharisees and Sadducees, called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing? They asked. Here is this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. So there's politics going on here. They're upset that Jesus is performing these miracles and people are believing in him. If he keeps going like this, they think everyone's going to believe in him. Everyone will follow him. And then what will happen is the Romans will crack down, right? The hammer's going to fall. And the Sadducees were collaborators with the Romans. That's important to know. The Sadducee equals priest, and the priest had made a deal with the Romans. The Romans had conquered Israel, and they had struck a deal with the priests. And the deal was basically this. The Romans said, okay, you can keep running your temple as long as you keep the people calm and obedient, right? Um, don't lead rebellions. Tell the people to be cool, right? Tell the people to accept our rule, and we will let you continue your sacrifices. And the Sadducees, again, by this time, were wealthy, they were powerful, and they didn't want to give up their power and their privilege. And the Romans gave them a way to keep it. So the Sadducees were in bed with the Romans. They were collaborating with them. They were keeping the people docile and obedient. And in return, the Romans were allowing them to continue to essentially keep their prestige and their wealth. So they're saying, look, this guy's going to ruin our deal. We've got a nice thing going on. We've got to deal with the Romans. We're living comfortable lives. This guy's going to come mess it up. And people are going to start following him. And the Romans are going to say, well, there's no use for you anymore, Sadducees. And this is actually exactly what happened in history. In AD 70, the Sadducees couldn't keep the people docile anymore. The people wanted to rebel. They wanted the Romans gone, and the Sadducees couldn't suppress the rebellions and couldn't suppress the unrest. And what the Romans did was they destroyed the temple, right? Because the Romans' deal was conditional on the Sadducees keeping the people docile and obedient. And when that didn't happen, the Romans said, well, there's no purpose in having you around anymore. And that's what they're afraid of. So their fear is actually justified, and what they feared is exactly what happened. So some interesting politics and history background here. Verse 49, then one of them named Caiaphas, and we'll try to get to the end of the chapter here. I know we're coming close to the hour. One of them named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up, you know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than the whole nation perish. In other words, it's expedient that we get rid of Jesus. Let him die. Let's kill him so that we can keep the peace in our country. That's their plan. And that's the logic, though, of sort of a typical politician, really. And it's the logic of sacrifice, right? If you want to make an omelet, you break some eggs. So yeah, we might have to. It's the logic of war, right? You have to go to war so that you can have peace. Some people have to die so that the rest of us can have order and go about our lives. And that's what they're saying. Let's kill this guy so that we can keep going in our peace and prosperity. And ironically, Caiaphas predicts what will happen. Jesus will die for the peace of everyone, just not the political peace and not for their prosperity and their cushy arrangement with the Romans, but Jesus would die for our spiritual peace. All right. Verse 51, he did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation. Right? So what John is telling us is Caiaphas is speaking as a shrewd politician, right? It's better if this guy dies so that we can continue our prosperous lives. But John is saying that there was a meaning to Caiaphas's words that even Caiaphas didn't understand, which was that Jesus would die for the peace of the nation, but just not at all the way Caiaphas imagines that, and not by Caiaphas's definition of any of those things. All right, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and to make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. Jesus doesn't just die for Israel. Jesus dies for the world. He dies for everyone, regardless of nation, creed, color. And Christianity is much bigger than national loyalty. God is not an Israelite, believe it or not. God is not an American. God's people cuts across every border, every national tie, every ethnicity, even gender, right? Paul says it. There's neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, nor male nor female, but all are one in Christ Jesus. That's exactly what John says here. Not only for that Jesus died, not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and to make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. So they're serious now about killing Jesus. They want him dead. Why? Because he's a threat to their arrangement with the Romans that is making them rich and prominent. We're almost done. Therefore, Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the Jews. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the desert, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. So he's going to lay low for a little bit outside the city. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. So Passover is the most important Jewish religious celebration. Celebrates the Exodus, when the 10 plagues came, the death of the firstborn. The lamb was slaughtered to protect the Jews, to save their firstborn, and God led them out of Egypt into the wilderness towards the promised land. That's Passover is what's coming. And John is drawing parallels because Jesus is the Passover lamb. Jesus is the lamb who is slain, whose blood protects us and saves us. They kept looking for Jesus, and as they stood in the temple area, they asked one another, "What do you think? Isn't he coming to the feast at all?" Right? It would have been strange for a rabbi like Jesus not to come to celebrate the Passover. So they're expecting him, and they're thinking, well, isn't it strange if he's not going to come? But the chief priests, the Sadducees, and Pharisees had given orders that if anyone found out where Jesus was, he should report it, so that they might arrest him. So they're ready to kill Jesus. The first opportunity, as soon as they find him, they're going to arrest him, and they're going to try to have him killed. John, we're now at chapter 12. We got a ways to go. There's what's coming ahead is a lot of teaching. So we'll pick that up next week. Jesus is going to give his teaching, his last words, his last instructions before he dies in the next coming weeks. So that finishes chapter 11, the raising of Lazarus. Remember, the glory of God is a human being, fully alive. Jesus raises the dead even after they stink. So that's the good news. I hope you're having a good week. I'm glad to see some comments. Oh, hi, Robin. Hi, Linda. Glad to see you saying hello to each other. And again, I'm grateful to be able to do this with you. And I'm looking forward to a time when we might see each other again. I hope you're well. Please let me know if there's anything you can do. If you didn't get this week's weekly happenings, this Sunday we're going to celebrate long range communion. So I'm going to lead communion on the live stream. And so what I'm asking you to do is get some kind of bread and some kind of cup. And it's up to you it's quarantine. You have what you have, and it's okay. But try to get some bread and try to get a grape juice or some wine. and we will take communion together on Sunday morning. And so you'll use your bread and your wine, and I'll use mine, but we'll do it at the same time. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope it's meaningful for you. Let me know if there's any questions you have or anything the church can help you with. God bless, and I will look to see you on Sunday.